All right. So if I could just introduce Jack Hill. Jack has written probably, well, really the most preeminent books on the 1809 campaign. He has written on the German troops that fought for the Federation of the Rhine for the French army, I think in a work called With Eagles to Glory. But he then had a series of works on the 1809 campaign, including a very important work called Thunder on the Danube, which has been critically acclaimed. And I would say at the moment, really, you are the world expert on the topic. So we are really honored to have Jack with us today to give us his thoughts on the Battle of Wagram and perhaps to give us some insights in relation to it, which one doesn't often hear, perhaps some, not only from the French side, but perhaps from the Austrian perspective, which you don't hear very much of in the past. So Jack, over to you, and I will try and get the slides in sync with what you're referring to.
Very good. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to talk to all of you this afternoon for you, this morning for me. I have spent a lot of time on this particular war, and I try to use the word war, not campaign, to be aligned with current NATO terminology and U.S. military terminology, as this is indeed a war that is composed of multiple campaigns, although the standard way to refer to these Napoleonic expeditions is to use the word campaign. I will try to give you a perspective that is very broad, and I hope set the stage for a discussion so we can have an interaction depending on how much time you have and where your level of interest lies. But I find this a particularly interesting conflict, one both in its political and diplomatic background, and two in its military evolution as it proceeds. So do we have the slides up there, Philip?
I'm going to bring them up now. So
Very
here we
good.
go. So this is the first slide,
Yep.
which has the Battle of Wagram, 5th to 6th July. Oops, sorry.
Yep, perfect.
Come up. I'm just trying to bring it back again, if I can get the screen to work. Sorry, are you still there? Yeah, here we go.
We're still there.
There we go. That's it. So the Battle of Wagram, 5th to 6th July, the greatest battle in modern times.
Yes, which is from Marshal Marmont, writing in his memoirs, so many years later. And what he's referring to is the greatest battle in modern times in terms of what one could see as a commander and for the number of troops assembled within the view of a commander. So there are certainly other battles that are also very large in the Napoleonic period, but and even subsequently, but that was his term, and of course he was present on the field at the time as a general of division, not yet a marshal. So next one, please.
A titanic struggle.
Yes, in the battle is indeed titanic. More than 340,000 men. There were more on the French side alone than there are at both sides in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 here in the United States. It is nearly 1,000 guns if you combine the two sides over 2 long, very hot summer days, and a firing line that by the end of the second day is more or less 22 kilometers long. The only battle, of course, that exceeds it in scope and size is that of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations in October of 1813, in terms of the Napoleonic period, and it's one of Europe's largest battles prior to 1914. So you have to get to Königgrätz and Sedan before you come up to something that is as large as this, other than Leipzig. Next one, please.
Outline.
So what I will do in the very typical American military style is give you the outline here. What are we going to talk about? So first off, how we got here to the Battle of Wagram in the first place. A little on the weather and the terrain, the armies, the plans of the two commanders, how the crossing takes place that brings the French army onto the left bank of the Danube, the cost, and then where we go next, please.
Wagram, the first weeks of war.
Okay, so we now look at how did this war begin? This is just an introductory slide. We can see this is a very famous painting of a famous scene where Napoleon outside of Regensburg or Ratisbon on the 23rd of April takes a slight wound, a contusion, one of the few times he was actually wounded, even though he was exposed to enemy fire a lot, particularly at Wagram, in fact. So this shows Regensburg burning in the background as Napoleon's wound is attended to on 23 April, just as he completes his victory over the Austrians in Bavaria that we'll talk about in a second. Next one, please.
The War to Wagram.
So we start off with, where is Austria in 1808? Austria is aggrieved and it's anxious. It had been a great power, but its status is now in question. And for some in Vienna, Napoleon's next target is indeed Austria. A war party, an anti-Napoleon party evolves in Vienna. When Napoleon invades Spain and dethrones the Spanish Bourbons, the anxieties of these people accelerates and intensifies. And they worry that Napoleon will now depose the Habsburg dynasty, destroy the Austrian state. However, as the French suffer setbacks in Spain in 1808 before Napoleon's arrival, this war party sees offensive opportunities, and it indulges in all manner of assumptions that will support what it sees as a preconceived notions of Napoleon planning to attack Austria. There's no evidence he planned to do that, but that's what they thought. So they see Napoleon personally and most of his veterans bogged down in Iberia. Napoleon had disbanded the Grande Armée in October of 1808 and sent many of the veterans to Spain, of course. They believe that Germany is going to rise up en masse against the French, that the Prussians will join along and commit their army, that the Russians will either join the Austrians, commit their army against the French, or at the very least remain friendly and neutral, and that Britain will supply untold numbers of pounds sterling, as well as a military diversion by conducting a landing in Germany, not in Holland, where the Britain actually does, but rather in Germany. So in Vienna, there's a decision to launch an offensive war. Unfortunately for them, none of their assumptions prove true. And we can also conclude this slide by noting that the army commander, the Archduke Charles, the next younger brother of the Emperor Kaiser Franz, he is skeptical and is not fully committed to this conflict. He does not think the army is ready, but embarks on the war as directed by his elder brother. Next one, please. So how does the war progress? The Austrians, following this offensive inclination or offensive illusion, invade Bavaria, Italy, Poland, and Dalmatia in April of 1809. Napoleon, however, quickly defeats the Hauptarmee, the Austrian main army in Bavaria, as we saw with the image of the fall of Regensburg on 23 April. And the other Austrian offensives also stall. May sees the French following up on the victory in Bavaria to drive on Vienna, and even though this leads to the repulse at Aspern-Essling, Napoleon's first attempt to cross the Danube against the Austrian main army or Hauptarmee, Napoleon nonetheless retains the psychological ascendancy that he had at the very beginning, and it was intensified by the victory in Bavaria. In the meantime, the Austrian invasion of Italy is led by the Archduke Johann, or John, Napoleon's stepson, his adopted son, Eugène de Beauharnais, drives Johann out of Italy. So that was the second priority for the Austrians, was the invasion of Italy. Well, following the repulse at Aspern-Essling, there's an operational pause around Vienna. That is to say, the two main armies, the French on the right bank, the Austrians on the left bank. Charles, the Austrian commander, sees no hope for an offensive. So although he has won a defensive victory over Napoleon at Aspern, he sees no hope for launching an Austrian offensive across the Danube to attack the French. And the French very quickly recover. Napoleon immediately begins to prepare a new attack across the Danube to bring the Austrian main army to battle. Eugène, he dispatches to Hungary, where Johann has retreated. And on the 14th of June, the anniversary of both Marengo and Friedland, Eugène defeats Johann at Raab. This is important for Wagram because it means that Eugène will now join Napoleon at Vienna and take part in the Battle of Wagram, whereas Johann's army is badly damaged and he has to retreat across the Danube to the northern side, the left bank, excuse me, and will be possibly available at Wagram, but as we'll see, does not actually turn up. In the meantime, the Austrians are also suffering setbacks in Poland and Dalmatia, their other two invasions. Next, please. Charles, by the way, as we change the slides, writes to the Emperor, Kaiser Franz, on the 23rd of June, so 2 months after the defeat in Bavaria, to say, our first strike failed, and with that, our hopes vanished. So this defeat in Bavaria had a dramatic impact on the Austrians in terms of morale as well as physically, so psychological and physical impact. And this just is a graphic representation of what's happened. I've highlighted in the blue and purple the Regensburg phase of the war. The French drive to Vienna. They suffer the defeat at Aspern-Essling in 21-22 May, and then we turn to the third phase of the main part of the war, which is the battles of Wagram and Znaim. But in the meantime, there's the campaign in Poland, there's the campaign in Hungary, there's the campaign in Italy. The Austrians invade Dalmatia, and they launch incursions into Germany as well. So next one, please. As we'll turn now to the battle itself and what's going on in terms of weather and terrain. And there's quite a dramatic change from the night of 4 and 5 July when the French launch their crossing of the branch of the Danube that separates them from the Austrians on the left bank. And this is a night of a violent thunderstorm, thunder and lightning that contend with artillery, and no one who was there forgot this scene. Drenching rain, everyone is soaked to the skin. The thunder and lightning are contending with the tremendous French artillery barrage and a much lighter Austrian response for a very dramatic kind of scene. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. The 5th and 6th of July, however, when the actual battle is taking place, or the majority of the battle takes place, were very hot and dry. And the soldiers and horses, of course, as well, were tormented by thirst. They didn't have much to eat either. And the standing crops, because it's July, most of the crops are ripening, and there were some that were already formed into haystacks or shocks of corn. Those often caught fire, which endangered the wounded. And so you have these horrible scenes of wounded men being burned to death because they could not creep away in time to save themselves. Next one, please. In terms of terrain, we have the Lobau Island, which we'll talk about quite a bit, which is a large island on the left bank of the Danube. It is separated from the mainland by what's called the Stadler Arm of the Danube. And so the French have to cross this branch of the river to get at the Austrians, who are on a place called the Markfeld, which is a large agricultural plain, which you fellows have laid out very nicely on your enormous terrain boards there. I'm really blown away by those. So this is a large flat plain. Of course, there's some minor undulations in the terrain, but not very much. It is covered with crops and dotted with villages, pretty robust little villages, but no real substantial forest or woods once you leave the Lobau area right around the island until you get up to the heights, of which there are two, the nearly barren Russbach Heights, which are low, that is to say 8 to 10 meters high at the most, and are on the northern side of the Markfeld. And they are provided with a sort of a moat, if you will, by the Russbach stream, from which the heights take their name. That is a small tree-lined stream bordered by willows that is in front of, or to the south of, the Russbach Heights, in front of from the French perspective. And then on the northwestern side is the Bissamberg, which is a set of low, maybe 200, 300 meters high, but very rugged and wooded hills that provide the Austrians with a key observation post from which they watch, or try to watch and observe what the French are doing prior to the battle. The Austrians do have some field fortifications, some redoubts and whatnot on the western and northern sides of Lobau, strangely enough, not on the eastern flank where the French actually crossed, but they do nothing of note on the Russbach Heights. Even Charles only orders that the construction of some redoubts or independent earthworks on the morning of the 5th, when the French have actually already begun to cross. So by then it's too late. Next, please. And we'll see here on this map The map, interestingly, is from the Austrian, what they call the first military survey. So this was a period map. The first military survey was done in the late 1700s. So this is more or less what the battlefield looked like in July of 1809. And we see to the upper northwest the Bissamberg, this collection of low wooded hills, and then the Russbach Heights, which I mentioned, and the Russbach that flows in front of them on the southern face. Lobau Island, separated from the mainland, the Markfeld, by the Stadler Arm, and Pressburg, where Johann is, as we'll talk about, is about 40 kilometers away to the southeast. Next one, please. So now we're going to look at the armies, and this is a wonder. I'd love this image of it's a period image of the attack on the churchyard in Aspern on 22 May during the battle there. Next, please. So we'll turn to the two armies, starting with the Habsburg host, and we see a very large army, the largest army Charles had ever commanded, with about 35,000 infantry and cavalry combined, plus you can add about 10% for all the other folks, the artillerymen, engineers, medical, etc. 388 guns, organized into an advanced guard, which is an ad hoc formation detached from other, with men detached or units detached from other units. And then the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 6th Corps with a reserve that is a combination of the grenadiers and heavy cavalry. Nearby, but not engaged in the battle, is the 5th Corps. It's about 10,000 men, 6,000 easily right close by, another 4,000 or so not far away, easily called in, but Charles chooses not to do that. They are up to the northwest. And then again, the Archduke Johann, who has about 18,600 men down at Pressburg, 40 kilometers away. He does eventually march to Wagram, but does not bring all of those. He leaves some behind to watch the French on the other side of the Danube. The army is a combination of regulars and Landwehr. Many of whom the Landwehr battalions, and that's how they were organized as individual battalions, are integrated into regular infantry regiments. And the Landwehr was, although some of the battalions do perform fairly well, quite stout, they do not match the solidity and endurance of the regulars, and often prove quite flighty. Some of them simply disintegrate when they're put under pressure. Generally speaking, the army has good morale, but the army is anxious about the superiority of French cavalry in numbers and even in quality. This is a real concern, particularly for Charles and his corps commanders. Most of the leadership at the senior levels is not particularly inspiring, and there is little initiative in the absence of Charles personally intervening to push his commanders to do things. This is certainly evident 21-22 May at Aspern-Essling, and becomes evident, and we'll see this also at Wagram. Next. Okay, so looking at the army in a schematic fashion, it's laid out here just with little boxes. You can see to give you the commanders' names: Nordmann, Bellegarde, Hohenzollern, and Herkichen, who is, by the way, a prince of the Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's allies, but he is fighting on behalf of the Austrians. Kolowrat, Rosenberg, who we'll talk about quite a bit, and Klenau. And then Liechtenstein, also a prince of the Confederation of the Rhine, and his little state belongs to the Confederation, but he personally is fighting on behalf of the Austrians, as are two of his brothers. In the vicinity is the 5th Corps under another German, Reuss Plauen, the Prince of Reuss Plauen, and then the Archduke Johann with IA, which is the Inner Austrian, or the Army of Inner Austria, Armee from Inner Österreich, which is down at Pressburg. Next one. But looking at Charles himself, he is certainly a talented and experienced commander. He's very courageous on the field of battle, but he's also very cautious, and he is more of a conservative 18th century commander, despite his numerous theoretical writings, than he is one who is fully adapted to what the changes that are going on in how armies perform in the early 19th century. He believes his empire needs peace, and needs peace now. And he has doubts about his own army, but he is convinced that the The army is the savior of the empire and the savior of the dynasty. And without a solid army, an army that will cause Napoleon to think twice, then the empire's destiny is in doubt. So his key concern is preserving the army to give the Austrians some negotiating power. He remains in awe of Napoleon, and it's important to remember that he is commander, not a ruler. Unlike Napoleon, who is the emperor, head of state, as well as head of the army, Charles is not, and he is in conflict with the hawks at court who want him to do something. And the fact that they want him to do something will cause serious problems for the Austrians as the campaign evolves. Next one, please. So we'll turn now to the other side, which is the French Army of Germany. It is not La Grande Armée. The Grande Armée, as I mentioned, had been disbanded in October of 1808. And so Napoleon has to create an ad hoc formation that is called then the Army of Germany in response to the Austrian invasion in April. By the 6th of July, the second day of the battle, you can see the very large force that the emperor has assembled. It is the largest force, like Charles, that he has ever commanded on a single field. And he has brought in every single soldier who could be spared. So he is focused on the destruction of the Austrian army and therefore has left his flanks and his rear with the absolute minimum of men. He has the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 9th Corps, the Cavalry Reserve. He's brought in one division of the 7th Corps, the 2nd Bavarian Division. That's the Bavarian Corps, the 7th. He's brought in the Army of Italy, as I mentioned, under his stepson, adopted son, Viceroy Eugene. And he's brought in the Army of Dalmatia under General Marmont from all the way down in the Balkans. And the Imperial Guard, much smaller in those days than we think of in 1812 or 1813, is also present, of course. The 8th Corps, nearby but not engaged, is stretched along approximately 120 kilometers of the Danube on the south bank, the right bank. That's the Württemberg contingent. And there's a detachment watching Johann at Pressburg, whereas Johann has nearly 19,000 men. There are about 5,000 or so French watching him. There is extraordinary unit cohesion on most of the French side, particularly in Davout's 3rd Corps, and there are a lot of veterans. The image that's often portrayed of the French army at this time is a collection of barely trained conscripts who are all 17 years old, and this is an erroneous representation. There are also a lot of German troops from the Confederation of the Rhine or the Rheinbund. Some of those, most of them, are actually very good. So they're not anxious to run away or defect or leave the battlefield on the first instance. And particularly the Baden and Hessian soldiers who are present are very good. The Bavarians are quite reliable. The Saxon Corps, the 9th Corps, on the other hand, is shaky. And we'll talk about them in some detail, not because they're anxious to desert Napoleon, but rather because they are entirely unsuited and inexperienced in this kind of modern Napoleonic warfare. So they will suffer also from their positioning on the field and being under the command of the controversial Marshal Bernadotte. In general, the army has very high morale and enormous confidence in Napoleon, including the Saxons and all the other Germans, oh, by the way. And there's excellent leadership at all levels. Next, please. So we'll see here in a schematic form the French Army of Germany with the 2nd Corps under General, not yet Marshal Oudinot, Marshal Davout in the 3rd Corps, the largest. Massena, another marshal, commands the 4th Corps. And I put those two little triangles there to indicate the Baden and Hessian brigades that are part of his command, his corps. Very good troops. Bernadotte commands the 9th Corps, mostly Saxons, but with one very small French division under a general named Dupas, and he'll feature in the forthcoming discussion as well. The Army of Italy under Eugene, and these are French regiments, not Italian, with the exception of the Italian Guard and one very good cavalry regiment. The troops are French regiments, so French uniformed, etc., not Italian. The Italians are mostly in Hungary and at Pressburg. Cavalry Reserve under Marshal Bessières and the Imperial Guard. Those are all present on the 5th. Arriving overnight or by the morning of the 6th of July are two further divisions, French again of the Army of Italy and the Army of Dalmatia, also French under General Marmont, and then Bavarian General Generalleutnant von Wrede with the 2nd Bavarian Division of the 7th Corps. Next, please. Okay, so if we compare the strengths, you can see how it changes over time from the 5th of July through the overnight as the French reinforcements arrive to where we end up on the 6th, again with French outnumbering the Austrians considerably until the arrival of Johann, but he does not appear until around 5 p.m., 1700 or so on the 6th of July, and really plays no substantial role in the battle. But I want to give this as a sense of how the strengths have evolved as the French reinforcements arrive, and Charles brings in no one other than Johann, and he arrives late. Next, please. So now we move over to the planning. So we see here Napoleon in this, I think, very lovely painting, riding over to Lobau Island, where he established his headquarters on the 1st of July. Next.
Charles.
So when we look at the Austrian side, I mentioned that since Aspern-Essling, there's been essentially 6 weeks of inaction, and Charles is experiencing a great deal of tension with the imperial court, who want him to do something. He is able to avoid what he sees as a futile offense, some kind of offensive option against the French, trying to cross the Danube and attack Napoleon on the south bank. But the court, because they're pressing him so hard, the Austrians come up with some very bizarre plans. And in the discussion period, if you want, I can talk about 2 of those that would have weakened the main army facing Napoleon had they been instituted, because the court is pressing him so hard to do something. And he would rather wait and try to find some way to peace while the army is still intact. So what to do when the French attack? Well, Charles vacillates. Will he defend right along the river line? Or will he allow the French to cross and fight them on the Markfeld, trying to repeat Aspern-Essling? If the French cross and turn to the northwest toward the Bissamberg, he could strike them on their right flank from the Russbach. If they drive towards the Russbach, he could perhaps strike them on their left flank from the Bissamberg, but he does not have enough troops to hold both of these heights and still conduct offensive operations. And he is still undecided when the French finally do move. So the result is, in my view, more or less half measures where the advance guard and the 6th Corps are along the river with some field fortifications, but the rest of the army is back, and we'll see it. I'll show this on a map in a moment, back in the rear on the heights, both the Bissamberg and the Russbach, but he doesn't institute any kind of fortifications on the heights, and he delays in calling Johann from down in Pressburg to the Markfeld. That order does not go out until 1900 hours on the 4th of July as the storm is coming in. And then Johann responds in a very torpid fashion, both in terms of getting his army together and then in the pace of his drive or his march from Pressburg to the battlefield. Next one, please. So looking at Napoleon's side, the French have been extremely active, very energetic. Napoleon has made extensive and meticulous preparations for a second crossing of the Danube. There will be no repeat of the problems they experienced at Aspern-Essling. Lobau Island has been turned into a vast encampment magazine workshop, including a flotilla made on the spot from scratch of 10 gunboats with 1 to 4 guns per boat, plus 20 other smaller craft. He is collecting, as I mentioned, every single bayonet, saber, and gun that he can bring together, but he's going to delay that concentration until the last moment so that the Austrians do not have time to react. And so they move forces on to the Lobau Island from the south bank of the Danube at night, so the Austrians on Bissamberg can't see them, for example. And he's going to use feints by drawing Austrian attention to the western side of the island when he really plans to conduct the assault on the eastern side. And his aim, as I mentioned, is to bring the Austrian main army, the Hauptarmee, to battle and destroy it, to end what for him is a very unwanted war as rapidly as possible. And here you can see the 2 enormous bridges that were built from the south bank of the Danube onto the series of islands that leads to the Lobau. This painting, if I'm not mistaken, hangs, by the way, in Apsley House. It was done by a fellow named Swaybach. And I believe if you enter Apsley House on the left-hand side, you can see this, the original of this painting. Next one, please.
Disposition.
So you can see here on this map, again from the Austrian First Military Survey, the dispositions on the 4th of July by late in the day, prior to the French conducting their crossing. Most of the French army has been concentrated, squashed onto Lobau Island. Some of the troops are still approaching the island. They're just waiting on the south bank for space to be available. And there's a garrison on the island, which includes 109 guns that are not part of the 475, oh, by the way, that Napoleon has gathered. This is an additional set of often siege guns, 18-pounders, etc., and large mortars that are going to cause enormous problems for the Austrians when the French crossing begins. And then still en route, the Army of Dalmatia, those two divisions of the Army of Italy, and the Bavarians are still on the way. Next, please.
Battle.
So we'll turn now to the battle. This is a great painting showing the French light cavalry of the Guard attacking Austrian dragoons late on the day of the second day. Next, please.
French assault.
So the French begin the attack on what one Saxon observer called a night out of Macbeth, this terrific thunderstorm and downpour that I mentioned, where human violence is contending with the violence of nature. But despite the weather, despite the darkness, despite Austrian opposition, the French operations proceed as planned. A very heavy bombardment from these major guns on the Lobau Island silences the Austrian guns on the other side. It demolishes many of the fortifications and causes heavy casualties among the Austrian defenders. And French assault parties cross over in boats at first, supported by the little flotilla, and bridge construction begins as soon as the boats enter the water, including what was called the Bridge of One Piece that kind of snapped into place, had been assembled in a side water and then snapped into place as it floated out into the current of the Stadler Arm. And it's really a truly remarkable feat of military organization and engineering that proceeds, again, despite being under a tremendous thunderstorm at night against opposition. The Austrians are overwhelmed with heavy losses, and in about 15 hours, Napoleon puts 150,000 men across this arm of the Danube with all of their gear, guns, and horses, and the army is ready to advance across the plain of the Markfeld. Next one, please.
French assault.
So we can see here this gives you a sense of the French attempt at a feint, which succeeded by drawing Austrian attention to the left side, the western side of Lobau Island. Also, while they're actually going to cross on the right-hand side, the eastern side, during the night of the 4th and 5th. And then you can see here, a friend of mine nicely highlighted the Austrian fortifications, that the small redoubts and whatnot they had built. The location of the 6th Corps goes up to Essling, and then the Austrian Army's advance guard on the eastern side around Groß-Enzersdorf. Next, please.
Music.
Okay, so the crossing is a great success. The Austrian 6th Corps retires to the northwest towards this Bissamberg. Not too many casualties, whereas the Austrian advance guard, 13 to 14,000 men, has been reduced to about 6,000 or 7,000, so 50% losses, and retreats to the right hand, or to the almost due north towards the Austrian 4th Corps on the left-hand side of the Austrian line. The French army is well established on the Markfeld. We'll see a map of that in a few moments. But late in the evening, as the French approach the Russbach position, Napoleon decides to test the Austrian position. It's not entirely clear what he wanted to do, and it may well be that his staff officers overinterpreted his rather vague guidance, but what results is a major French assault on the Russbach position late in the evening, which is to say sometime after 6 o'clock, between 18 and 1900, this order goes out and the French begin the attack. Now the sun is setting around 1900. So this is an attack in the dusk, and the gloom will have an impact on how it proceeds. The Saxons attack Wagram itself, the Army of Italy and the General Dupat's French division from 9th Corps attack in the center. Balmersdorf in the middle of the position is attacked by Oudinot's Second Corps, and Davout with the Third Corps is probably the one who actually follows Napoleon's unstated intention by more or less conducting a movement towards the Austrian left and a reconnaissance by fire of the Austrian position, but he does not commit his men to an actual assault, unlike the rest of the army. Despite the lack of coordination, I mentioned poor coordination here, and also all the other problems, the French come very close to success at several points. But they are undone by the poor coordination, by fratricide. The Saxons have white uniforms, and in the gloom, Saxons fire on other Saxons, French fire on Saxons, and the Austrian defense is very desperate. If you were playing, as I do, in a cardboard cannon arena as opposed to your metal miniatures, this would be a case where the Austrian leadership, Charles himself, as well as Bellegarde and the Second Corps commander Hohenzollern, their leadership at several points would give you, say, a +1 or a +2 on the die roll. So this desperate defense helps to repel the French assaults, and the end result is confusion as the French fall back in confusion with considerable losses in the darkness. Next, please. And so this map shows the situation on the night of the 5th of July. Again, the Saxons assault Wagram, Dupont and the Army of Italy in the center between Wagram and Balmersdorf, which is the village in the center of the Russbach Heights position, against Balmersdorf, and to the east thereof, the French Second Corps. And then Davout makes this sort of probe towards the Austrian left, the Austrian Fourth Corps into Rosenberg, but does not really commit his troops and does not suffer much in the way of losses. Next one, please. So this brings us to the morning of the 6th of July. And whereas the French had launched an offensive that was not well coordinated on the evening of the 5th, the Austrians plan an offensive on the 6th. The Austrians, despite being outnumbered, are going to launch their army against both wings of the French command, and they are poorly coordinated, so that the left, under Rosenberg, this Fourth Corps, is repulsed with loss before the right wing even begins to move. This is largely a result of the delays in the Austrians issuing the orders and very poor staff work to coordinate the two wings of the army. And by doing this kind of an attack on both sides of the French forces, with both wings of the Austrian force, the Archduke Charles has left himself with no reserve, which will be important as we proceed. The Austrians do secure the village of Otterklau, right in the center of the French line, the sort of pivot of the French line. In a very bitter fight, the Saxon infantry, notably not the cavalry or the artillery, the Saxon infantry, which is not prepared, as I mentioned, for this kind of warfare, is not well trained, and is here really in their first major fight for decades. And they are caught at this pivot. So they are in a vicious artillery crossfire, suffer very heavy casualties, and basically rout off the field. They're out of action. The combination of their lack of preparation for this kind of fighting, the crossfire, and their very heavy losses in the failed attempt at Wagram the night before result in the Saxons and Dupont retreating and being out of action after the first couple of hours of battle on the 6th of July. On the right-hand side of the Austrian line, Feldmarschall Lieutenant von Klenau pushes as far as Aspern and Essling, and he therefore threatens the bridges that lead from the Markfeld onto Lobau Island. So this is very dangerous on the French left. So we have a crisis on the French side and momentary chaos in the center near Otterklau, where the Saxons have left and where French attempts to capture the village have been repulsed. But Napoleon remains calm. And as the Austrian military historian Manfred Rauchensteiner says, he makes military history. He turns Massena's corps 90 degrees to the left and has it march across the front of the Austrian forces to retrieve the situation on the French left. He turns the Army of Italy, and we'll see General MacDonald in a moment, he turns them 90 degrees to the left as well, and they are going to prepare themselves to attack the Austrian center. He fills the gap in his own center with a battery of 100 guns. All of this is done with no prior planning, on the spot, under fire, and the army, not only can Napoleon conceive of these things in the instant and turn them into orders, but his army is able to respond, which to me is another indication that all the discussion about the French being conscripts and incapable is rather exaggerated. Napoleon knows in the meantime that the key to his battle is the progress of Marshal Davout on the French right. In the village of Markgraf Neusiedl, where the Austrian Fourth Corps under Rosenberg is located, that Davout's progress is going to be what determines the outcome, because as Davout moves against the Austrians on the Austrian left and pushes them back, that will unhinge the entire Austrian position. And he's watching the progress of Davout's firing line as marked by a large stone tower in this village of Markgraf Neusiedl that's visible from his position at the center of the French line. Next, please. So this map will show you a visual depiction of where the French are, and about a little after midday on the 6th of July.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No,
It's like delay in getting the slide across. We're with you now.
No problems. And you can see here, so it's now between 1 and 2 o'clock, 13 to 1400 on the afternoon of the 6th. Now, McDonald's so-called square, in this hollow square, is advancing on Zussenbrunn. The Davout has bent the Austrian line back on the left of the Austrian position and is mounted the Rosbach Heights, joined now by Oudinot with the Second Corps. As Davout advances, Napoleon sends Second Corps forward, and Massena has turned 90 degrees to his left and marched all the way to Essling and Aspern and is pushing the Austrians back to the west. So this gives you kind of an impression of how things have changed since the morning battle. The French have retained their hold on Lobau Island, and despite the Austrians pressing as far as Essling, they are now in retreat. And Charles has no reserve to commit to alter the situation. Next one, please.
Back to.
So it's shortly after noon, and Napoleon's measures begin to take effect, as we just saw on the map. Davout has bent the Austrian left back and takes Markgraf Neusiedl. Napoleon can see his firing line past that tower I mentioned. Oudinot joins the assault on the Rosbach Heights. Massena has driven Klenau and the Austrian Sixth Corps back, and MacDonald is pushing for Zussenbrunn with support from other French forces. And although his attack stalls with heavy losses, he continues to Gerasdorf. So even though he stalls, and this is seen as a great fiasco or a failure on the French part, he does continue to advance. But even though his attack is not penetrating, not breaking through and crushing the Austrian center, even though he advances, that he's not able to break through, but the Austrians' flanks are imperiled by Massena on the left and by Davout on the French right, and Charles has no reserves. So as Davout's battle report says, French success was no longer in doubt. And Charles, around 1430 or so in the afternoon, issues the order to retreat. There is some heavy fighting as night approaches. That fighting costs the life of French General Lassalle in leading a cavalry charge with Massena's corps, at the head of Massena's corps on the French left. It also causes his successor, General Marolaz, to be wounded for the 19th time, and his wounds are now so severe that he will never again take part in a campaign. But despite this heavy fighting, much of the action is really the French following rather than pursuing the Austrians, and the Austrians are able to escape badly battered, but nonetheless intact. Next one, please. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is that the French have to fight both sides. The cost is very high. So there is a French victory, but it's very dearly purchased, as you can see. And the Austrian army is still intact, despite the enormous effort. And there's some great quotes from General Savary about how Napoleon felt dissatisfied because despite all the effort he put into bringing this battle and the great success of the river crossing, he at one point says that Napoleon, that the Danube no longer exists for the French army, which was, yes, sounds very boastful, but was also largely true. However, despite the victory at Wagram, it's not sufficient to end the war by itself, and another battle becomes necessary. So we'll turn to the next slide to see what that's about in order to end this war that Napoleon didn't want in the first place. And that additional clash is at a place called Znaim, or Znjomo, if I can kind of get the Czech pronunciation correct, which is north of Wagram in Moravia, and that takes place on the 10th and the 11th of July. It's to me, a very fascinating battle. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent all the time to write a book about it, because it's an interesting combination of military action and a very interesting tactical situation, a very interesting operational situation, and it's intimately intertwined. So the battlefield action is intimately intertwined with what's going on diplomatically at the same time. The result of this conflict and this diplomacy is an armistice that takes place at midnight on 11 and 12 July. But that is the topic of a different presentation, which I'd be happy to give at some point. You know, Philip, if you guys want to learn about the Battle of Znaim, I think it's a really interesting engagement from as I say, from a military standpoint, as well as from the intermixing of military and diplomacy. So we can talk about that if you want to do that. We can do that in the future. But in the meantime, we'll go to what happens afterwards. So we now have an armistice that Charles has signed on behalf of the Austrian Empire. However, in signing this armistice, he has incurred the wrath of his enemies at court, who do not hold him in high regard, despite his military theoretical writings and despite his success in the 1790s against revolutionary France, and despite his position as the younger brother of the Austrian emperor. He has many enemies in the imperial court. They doubted his capacity as a commander against Napoleon prior to the war, and they continued to do so during the conflict. And now that this armistice has been signed, their ire is raised to a new peak. So as we wait for the next one to come up.
From armistice to peace.
Yes. So both sides rebuild after this 12th of July armistice, but the Austrians cannot decide on what their policy should be. Do they really want to make peace with the French, or should they renew the war? And this strong party at court is pressing for a renewal of the conflict, but the emperor, who's furious that Charles has, and it was within Charles's authority to do this, but the emperor did not wait around to personally approve the armistice, and he's furious that Charles has signed it. So Charles is fired. He does resign his commission, but basically because he knows that he is about to receive a letter relieving him of his position as the overall army commander. So now the Austrians have no overall army commander of anywhere near Charles's stature. Liechtenstein is appointed to that position. But he's not in Charles's level of competence at all, and does not have Charles's level of support within the army or anywhere else. And the Austrians can't make up their minds as to what they want to do. Napoleon, who is not going to let them escape without some punishment, is content to wait and see what the Austrians will do. So peace talks drag on until October, when the Austrians finally accept the inevitable, that they really are not in a position to renew the conflict with any hope of success. And Liechtenstein signs the Treaty of Schönbrunn at the Schönbrunn Palace outside of Vienna on the 14th of October, that brings the war to a conclusion. So armistice on the 12th of July, and then several months elapsed before the 14th of October, when the Treaty of Schönbrunn is signed. The Austrians then become a French ally. Their new foreign minister is a gentleman named Metternich, who will, of course, dominate Austrian policy for the next 3 decades. They become a French ally, at least temporarily, and await better days. Next slide, please. So and again, we can elaborate on any of these points as interests you or as you like. Napoleon does impose fairly harsh conditions. He could have imposed more harsh ones. He could have destroyed the Habsburg realm had he so desired. He chooses not to do so. He gains in the result of the war through Metternich, a political military ally who will send, in fact, even an Austrian corps into Russia in 1812. He also gains a new wife in the daughter of Kaiser Franz, Maria Louise, and a much desired heir, thanks to Maria Louise, on the 20th of March in 1811. So he marries her in 1810. They have a child who becomes the King of Rome as his title in March of 1811. And I put on the side there with the portrait of Maria Louise and the little King of Rome. I hope he loses his head entirely, which is something that Maria Louise had written to her father, Kaiser Franz, in April of 1809, when the war began, as she was considering what might happen, that she would, hoping Napoleon would lose his head entirely, and ends up marrying him a year later. The outcome of the war, however, does not solve the fundamental problems of Britain, of Spain, Napoleon's anxieties about his own legitimacy and those sorts of things. And there's friction with the Russians that arises in 1809. We have not talked about Poland very much, but the Russians contribute a force in Poland in 1809, and disputes over the outcome in Poland will contribute to the frictions between France and Russia that lead to the war in 1812. To me, 1809 illustrates the core strengths of the French army, but it also is evidence of the beginnings of French military decline. And perhaps even more important is that their enemies are improving. So the Austrians have improved over time and are therefore able to, therefore the army does not collapse, the Austrian army does not collapse or disintegrate after Wagram or after Znaim, but it is not in a position to defeat the French either. And what happens is then that Napoleon's enemies bide their time and wait. The opportunity for them then arises in 1813 after the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. So with the next slide, we set the stage, I hope, for a discussion with all of you, and I'm happy to entertain questions or comments or elaborate on any of the points we've made here. And I'll look forward to, once you conclude, to the outcome of your leaden engagement at Wagram. So any questions or observations, I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you very much indeed, Jack. That's been fantastic. I'm just going to try and come out of the presentation if I can and get you back on plan to show.
Yeah, sure.
There we go. And hopefully,
I love this image for us. I love this image, by the way.
Well, you're there. I'm going to expand you now. Hopefully it'll work. There we go. All right. That's great. So,
I love that image. It was the painting was a gift to me from an aunt of mine, and it's an apocryphal scene that Napoleon supposedly had come upon some sentry who'd fallen asleep and therefore takes the sentry's musket. And so the sentry, of course, wakes up in alarm that, oh dear, the emperor has come upon me and I've committed a gross error here in not in falling asleep while on sentry duty. It's not a real story, but it's part of the legendary associated with the French emperor. But anyway, any questions or points you'd like elaboration on?
On the McDonald Square you mentioned, yeah. I mean, that sounds to me like a very strange formation which didn't achieve that much. What was the logic behind that?
I think the logic is severalfold. One is that the formation was designed to protect the advance against the Austrian center on at least three sides. McDonald's also concerned about the rear of his formation. Basically, it's a three-sided square, the rear of which is covered initially by a regiment of mounted carabiniers. There were two regiments of carabiniers, you probably know, in the French army, two regiments of heavy cavalry. At that time, they did not yet have the cuirass that becomes part of their uniform in 1810. And they wore giant bearskin caps like the mounted grenadiers of the French Imperial Guard. So he covers the rear of the square, so-called, is covered by this regiment of carabiniers at first. But the idea was that it's going to drive into the Austrian center and therefore needs protection on all sides. The Austrians do try cavalry charges, which are handily repelled by well-controlled.
Sorry, Jack, we've just lost. We just had a loss of your volume for a second there. Sorry.
Okay.
You're okay now.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you're back.
So they have to be protected on three sides, to the front and to the two flanks, because he's going to drive into the Austrian center. And that proves useful because the well-directed musketry from the sides of this so-called square are able to drive off Austrian cavalry attacks. But it is also a huge artillery target. And the casualties suffered are very high as a result of that. And the Austrians, because they're better organized in 1809 than they had been earlier, do not break. So MacDonald's attack slowly stalls, and in part because there's a failure of coordination, where the French cavalry, particularly the cavalry of the Guard, is supposed to assist MacDonald, but that famous painting of Napoleon with his telescope up to his eye, in the background of that painting is Marshal Bessières falling off his horse because he's been wounded. And the commander of the French Guard cavalry, a gentleman named Walter, decides that, mulishly in my mind, decides not to obey when MacDonald calls on him to charge, because there's an opportunity as the Austrians are reeling. And he says, well, I cannot charge without an order from Marshal Bessières or the emperor himself. And by the time with Bessières wounded, that does not happen, and the moment of opportunity passes. So the French cavalry, which has done very well in many cases, does not support MacDonald's square, so-called square. And again, it's not a solid square. It is two divisions, about 8,000 men, followed by another 3,000 that MacDonald doesn't count in his after-action report. So about 8,000 men in this large hollow square that advances against the Austrian center, stalls, and then Napoleon sends Wrede with the Bavarian division forward to support. And the advance then continues, as I mentioned, as far as Gerasdorf. MacDonald is able to seize both Zussenbrunn and Gerasdorf by outflanking the two villages on their northern sides to the right from the French perspective. So I hope that gives some sense of things.
Could I ask one question, Jack? Some books have said that the Austrians fought rather better in this war because of nationalism taking hold, which is an odd idea, because as we know from the First World War, when nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire did take hold, the Austrian Empire then fell apart because the Czechs and the Hungarians all wanted to become separate nations. So do you think there's anything in this idea of nationalism being part of the Austrian resurgence, or is that a myth, do you think?
I think it is exaggerated. There was certainly an effort on the part of the Austrian Empire to rouse the people, at least the German-speaking peoples of this polyglot empire, prior to the war. And so there's an efflorescence, a profusion of poetry, plays, various pamphlets and broadsheets that are issued that are trying to rouse the people of Austria against the French. And the Landwehr that is formed for the first time, beginning in 1808, is supposed to be an embodiment of this sense of Austrian opposition to the French and an embodiment of the people. We have to keep in mind that it's 1808, 1809. The Austrians, like others, are inspired by very canted, distorted images coming out of Spain, that somehow a people's war, a Volkskrieg, is the way to oppose the French. And so they had this image that's been portrayed through Spanish sources of what's going on in Spain at the time, and they see a national uprising as being one way to deal with the French. However, this notion of a Volkskrieg and a people's war is in tension with, in conflict with, the very strict monarchical notions of monarchical legitimacy and the absolute divine right of kings that predominate in Vienna and amongst all of the Austrian elite. So how do you have a people's war that's inspiring all the local peasants and whatnot to fight against the French and take up arms when you really don't want the peasants to have arms? You really don't want them to question monarchs and monarchical legitimacy and that sort of thing. So they never really sort this out. And the idea is that Germany will rise up against the French. Yes, that's all fine, but very much under control of the Austrian leadership. So very much under control of the Austrian emperor and the imperial apparatus in Vienna. And much of this whole notion kind of fades after the first few weeks, particularly after the disastrous defeats in Bavaria in April. And I would credit the Austrian performance more to the change in organization and the solid training and whatnot, and the sense of loyalty to the empire, to the emperor, to the regiment, the faith in Charles among many of the soldiers as well, rather than a sense of nationalism. There's a book by a gentleman named Robert Epstein in the United States, who credits one of the changes that takes place in Napoleon's enemies is the formation is adopting the corps d'armée system of the French. And that this gives, in Epstein's opinion, with which I agree, a greater solidity and resilience to the Austrian forces. They adopt this corps d'armée system for the first time in 1809. And they do it rather late in the day, not till February. So there's no time to train, no time to prepare. The corps commanders have no clue what to do as semi-independent leaders, semi-independent commanders of corps, as the French commanders do. But this does give greater solidity to the Austrian formations, and therefore, in my view, makes it less likely that they will disperse and scatter and collapse as they might have done or as they did do in 1805, and as the Prussians do in 1806. So less nationalism and much more sort of military structure and loyalty to the empire.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Jack?
Just on the nationalistic bit, how does that link in with the Tyrol revolt with Andreas Hohenlohe?
Yeah. This is great. Thank you. In my view, and I think in the view of most scholars, the Tyrolean rebellion is very much a localized event, and this is a region that is very loyal to the Habsburg dynasty, had enjoyed considerable, if you will, sort of autonomy within the empire, and had very deep traditions of sort of Catholic religion in its own kind of Tyrolean Catholicism. So to me, this is not an expression of German nationalism, although it is adopted by German nationalists in the latter part of the 19th century. So from, say, the 1820s on, Andreas Hofer and the Tyroleans are seen as some kind of a precursor or a part and parcel of some German national uprising against the French. But to me, this is largely invention. The Tyroleans had planned this uprising prior to 1809 with collaboration with the forces, or the war party in Vienna. So when the war breaks out, the Austrians send regular troops into the Tyrol. The Tyroleans rise up. There's often a lot of friction between the Tyroleans and the Austrian regulars who are there, because the Tyroleans fear that the regulars are going to abandon them, which eventually they do, and for very good logical military reasons. So yes, there is an uprising in the Tyrol, but it is, of course, an uprising against not the French, but against the ruler of the Tyrol, who is the king of Bavaria. Oh, by the way, a German, and oh, by the way, also a Catholic. And the Tyroleans, on the other hand, however, see the Bavarians as very intrusive. The Bavarian military bureau, the Bavarian bureaucrats turn up in the Tyrol once it's given to Bavaria in 1805, and at the result of the War of 1805. Bavaria becomes part of the Tyrol, or the Tyrol becomes part of Bavaria, and the Bavarian bureaucrats show up with this kind of reformist zeal, and so they are going to change everything and incorporate forcefully the Tyrol into the Bavarian kingdom. The Tyroleans do not think much of this, and they resent the imposition of Bavarian forms of Catholicism, Bavarian forms of governance, including conscription, oh, by the way, which is bitterly resented in the Tyrol, which had a long, centuries-old tradition of military independence and raising their own military forces to fight on behalf of the Habsburg Empire. So this is much more a revolt against the imposition of Bavarian rule. Yes, imposed, the French are the ones who Napoleon is the one who hands the Tyrol to Bavaria, but much more a revolt against the Bavarians and in support of the Habsburg dynasty rather than some kind of precursor to German nationalism, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
And it's a very interesting revolt, oh, by the way, in that, and you can look at this from a whole variety of perspectives. One perspective is that Napoleon does not focus on the revolt in the Tyrol because he is absolutely focused on the destruction of the Austrian regular army, because he knows that once that is done, the Tyrol revolt will solve itself in a way. He very much wants the Bavarians to sort out the problems in the Tyrol, and there are very few French troops involved at all until the very end. And so when he moves to Wagram, he takes the 2nd Bavarian Division, as I mentioned, under General Wrede. He leaves at Linz the 1st Bavarian Division. There are 3 divisions. He leaves the 1st Bavarian Division at Linz. The 3rd Bavarian Division had been kind of monitoring the Tyrol. But because of the focus on Wagram and the Austrian main army, the 3rd Bavarian Division is also ordered to Linz to watch the Austrians who are in Bohemia. And he is very content to leave the Tyrol kind of contained by second-line forces, Bavarian reserves, Italian reserves, and depot troops, and these kinds of folks. Let that be contained while I focus on the Austrian main army. So that's kind of the strategic perspective. And it's not until the end, until the peace is signed in October, that he sends a large number of French troops in, and French and Italian troops, along with the Bavarians, to quell the rebellion. And they come in from all sides and have to really swamp the Tyrol with troops before the rebellion is quelled. And the fighting goes on in various levels of intensity until early 1810, even after the peace had been signed in October of 1809.
Well, Jack, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fantastic talk, and we're really honored that you spent the time to speak to us today. And I just wonder if we can all have a round of applause for our speakers.
Well, I can leave you with one final thought, and that is the British role, which may be of some interest, because this coincides, of course, with the invasion of Walcheren Island in Holland, which the Austrians had hoped, as I mentioned, that the British would invade in Germany, and thereby thinking that this would lead to a German uprising, which does not happen, because London has its own ideas, and the court of St. James is concerned about French naval activity in Antwerp, and therefore invades at Walcheren, which of course turns into a fiasco for the British side, and comes after the armistice had been signed and way too late to support the Austrians, who are more or less left on their own as a result of their own poor planning and the interactions between the British Prime Minister at the time, of course, is Canning, and his reaction when the Austrians send their requests, rather enormous requests, what they're expecting in terms of cash subsidies and military action to Britain. Canning's reaction is, oh, this is complete nonsense, and they has no faith in the Austrians that they're really going to do anything effective, and therefore the British support is or the British activity involvement is very much focused on British interests and not on the Austrians. Anyway, so that is kind of a last point. I very much look forward to hearing how your engagement turns out, and wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you very much. And Jack, thank you very much again. Jack, will be in touch. I hope if you're ever coming across the Atlantic that we'll have a chance to meet you. So I'll be in touch and find out what your movements are in the coming months.
Look forward to
we'll
doing
let you know
so.
if we're doing Zanem for sure. That's for sure.
Great.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.